What did the original cross of Christ look like? And how was Jesus' body placed on that cross? These are two questions I received, two great questions, from somebody who is interested in finding an accurate representation of the actual cross of Christ. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual cross itself, we don't have much certainty about what it looked like. Using the Passion narratives in the Gospels, using other ancient sources outside the Bible, using modern forensics about the manner and mechanism of death, scholars have been able to reconstruct many of the details of ancient crucifixion with a high degree of certainty and accuracy. In other words, we can know with a lot of certainty what Jesus had to endure on the cross. When it comes to the actual cross itself, what it looked like and what Jesus' position on it was, how he was positioned, fastened to it, we can only take educated guesses. And there's a good reason for that. In their arts and artifacts, the early Christians didn't preserve this information for us. And you can't blame them. The first image we have of a cross is in the 3rd century in the catacombs. It's just an image of a cross etched into the side of one of the catacombs. It's not until the 4th century that Christians started featuring the cross in their arts and artifacts. And again, there's good reason for that. As Paul says, for those early Christians, the cross was a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. It was the worst implement of torture devised at the time. It was the most shameful death possible, a death reserved mainly for slaves and criminals. So you can't blame them for not wanting to wear a replica of this implement of capital punishment, this most shameful, barbarous, horrific death around their necks, or have this implement of torture featured in the center of their worship services. So they don't preserve any images of the cross, and neither do the Romans. In Greco-Roman culture, it was thought not proper to talk about the cross. The cross was thought of as too barbaric to bring up in polite company. In fact, Cicero says that the word cross literally shouldn't cross the thoughts of Roman citizens or be on their lips. So we don't have much information about what the cross looked like in those Roman sources, the non-biblical sources either. Our best information then comes from the Gospels. We have to rely on the Gospels for most of our information about what the cross might have looked like, but they don't bother to describe it either. And that's probably because the people they're writing to, the audiences they're writing to, would be all too familiar with what the cross looked like. However, we do find clues in the Gospels that can help us put the pieces together and with a fair degree of accuracy, figure out what the cross probably looked like and how Jesus was placed on it. So what do we know? In the non-biblical sources from ancient Greco-Roman history, here are several of the things that we know. In addition to our traditional image of the cross, this way, there were several other forms the cross took. One way that the Romans crucified was simply to have the person attached to a stake in the ground, just the vertical pole of the cross. There was no crossbeam at all. Then they would take their hands, put them together over their head, and fasten them above their head on that stake. Another form the cross took was scaffolding. It was just a number of vertical planks placed in the ground. That way the Romans could crucify a number of people at once at the same time, which was often their practice. Sometimes the cross would appear as an X. It would look like an X. It was at a diagonal, an angle, so the person was crucified at an angle. And sometimes it was in the form of a tau, T-A-U, which just simply looks like a T. It's a T-shaped cross. Furthermore, we know that the Romans used two different methods for fastening somebody, fixing them to the cross. One was to tie them, and the other was to nail them to the cross, using iron nails about 5 to 7 inches long. Sometimes they used both those methods. Sometimes they would tie and nail somebody to the cross. Unlike our impressions of the cross, where it's way high up, we usually look up at the cross is actually very low to the ground. We know from those ancient Roman sources that animals would often come and ravage the feet of the victim, the person being crucified. So their feet, scholars believe, had to be a foot or less from the ground. So they were almost at regular height when they were crucified. And then we know that there was either a footstool provided for underneath the feet or a little seat underneath the buttocks for the person being crucified oftentimes, or sometimes both. And that wasn't done for the person's comfort. It was actually a demonic device, demonically devised by the Romans to prolong the torture. One of the effects of crucifixion was that it would slowly suffocate you, that with your arms outstretched, your chest cavity, there was tremendous pressure on it. And so the person being crucified was desperate to catch their breath. They keep trying to catch their breath. And if they didn't have the footstool or the little seat implement, their death would happen faster because the chest cavity would just simply crush in on them. But if they had that, they could push themselves up slightly and catch another breath, which would simply prolong their agony, keep the torture going even longer. Most crucifixions, though, it seems, happen in the way that we have traditionally depicted and understood them. Most crucifixions, it seems, happen with a vertical post already fixed in the ground, and then the horizontal crossbeam being separate, the person being tied off or nailed to that on the ground, and then hoisted up with these forked poles. The Roman soldiers would use forked poles to push the crossbeam and the person up onto the vertical beam, and then there was a notch in the vertical beam that the crossbeam would slide into, and then they'd be, they'd finish off attaching them to that by nailing or tying off their feet to crucify the person. In 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem discovered a cadaver of what they believe was a man in his 20s who had been crucified sometime decades before 70, which is the destruction of the temple, which puts him very close to the time of Jesus. And his cadaver has one of the nails, the iron nails, through one of his feet. And so what scholars believe happened is, unlike we think of the feet being crucified as one on top of the other and then a single nail going through it, is that his feet were actually straddling that vertical beam. They were on either side of it, and there were two nails used, one on either side, with a piece of olive wood on the outside of the nail, so he couldn't work his foot out of the nail as he was being crucified. That's what we know from the ancient sources outside of the Bible about crucifixion. Here's what the Gospels provide in terms of clues that can help us figure out how Jesus was crucified, what his cross would have looked like, and how he would have been positioned on it. So the clues from the Gospel that give us a pretty good, accurate understanding, likely understanding of what happened are these when you put it all together. First of all, we know that Jesus was nailed to the cross. Luke 24 tells us that his hands and his feet were pierced. So when you take information from the Gospels that scholars believe is trustworthy historically, that's one of the pieces that scholars think accurately reflects what happened. And piercing would imply that he was nailed to the cross, not tied to the cross. In John 20, in two different places, it talks about the imprints in Jesus' hand, which is further evidence that he was nailed to the cross. But the word hand in both Hebrew and Greek can include anything from the elbow to the tip of the finger. So we know from forensic studies that the body weight, that a nail through the palm couldn't support the body weight. It would just simply rip right out through the hand. So what the Romans would normally do is put the nail through the wrist, which happened to hit the median nerve, which is absolutely excruciating. We know that Jesus, because he died quickly, was probably not given, or most likely, almost certainly not given the footstool or the seat. And the fact that the Romans wanted his death to happen quickly, they wanted to expedite it so that his body wouldn't be there on the Sabbath, which could cause potentially riots in Jerusalem. Because they wanted to expedite his death, it would make no sense for them to provide the footstool or the little seat. What hastened his death most certainly was the scourging, the horrific scourging he experienced beforehand. But then it would make no sense if the Romans were trying to have this happen quickly for them to try to prolong it somehow by providing the footstool or the little seat. Jesus, most scholars conjecture, a commonplace guess by scholars, probably stood about 7 feet high. His head was like 7 feet above the ground. The reason they think that is because it says that when people try to give him that sponge-soaked wine, kind of as an anesthetic, it was typical in crucifixion towards the end to give the person a little bit of relief with this anesthetic, that they had to put it up on a reed or hyssop to get it to him, which means that he couldn't have been as low as some crucifixions were. He was somewhat elevated, so they guess about 7 feet high. And we can be fairly confident that Jesus was crucified in the traditional manner because his cross, he had to carry his cross to the place of crucifixion, which wouldn't mean the whole thing. It would mean the cross beam. The cross beam was placed on a person's shoulder and they were led out to the place of execution. So he was most likely crucified in that traditional manner. Furthermore, there was an inscription above the cross, and that means that the cross had to have that upper portion. It couldn't be the tau or any other form. It had to have the beam, the vertical beam, extending above his head for the inscription to be affixed to it. So in the end, these clues give us a fairly good idea of how Jesus was crucified, what his cross looked like, and what his position on the cross would have been. And we can say these things not with absolute certainty, but with a lot of probability that this is exactly what happened. Everything else about the crucifixion is conjecture about how the cross would have looked and how he would have been placed on that. Everything else is conjecture. We just can't say with any kind of confidence or certainty what happened. However, what we can say with absolute certainty is the sheer agony Jesus experienced on the cross. And it's easy to lose sight of that in an analysis like this. It's easy to lose sight of how much he suffered, how excruciating that kind of death actually was. But we can be absolutely certain of that. And what we can be absolutely certain of most is that he did that for us, out of his tremendous love for us. I truly appreciate your questions and comments. I love getting them. So if you have a question or comment you want to submit, you can go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave it there. I look forward to hearing from you.